The morning of August 12, 1944. A dirt road outside Oględów, Poland. 3 King Tiger tanks, the newest and most formidable armoured vehicles in the German arsenal, rolled toward a bridge over the Vistula River. Each weighed nearly 70 tons. Each mounted an 88mm gun, capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2.5 kilometers. Each was protected by armour up to 185mm thick on the turret front armour that no Allied tank gun could reliably penetrate. Inside the second King Tiger in the column, the crew moved with the practiced efficiency of men who trusted their machine. The loader stood ready beside ammunition racks mounted in the rear overhang of the turret. 23 rounds stored there for quick access, high explosive and armour-piercing shells within arm's reach. The commander scanned the cornfields through his optics. The gunner kept his eye to the Turmzielfernrohr 9D Sight 1 of the finest pieces of optical equipment produced during the war. The driver felt the Maybach engine's steady vibration through the controls. They had reason for confidence. The King Tiger represented the pinnacle of German tank design. Since its combat debut in Normandy just weeks earlier, it had proven nearly invincible in frontal engagements. Soviet intelligence briefings warned Red Army crews that the new German heavy tank could only be defeated through flanking attacks or by targeting its thinner side armour. Frontal penetration was considered nearly impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But at 200 meters, hidden in a cornfield with his turret camouflaged by corn stalks, Guards Junior Lieutenant Alexander Petrovich Oskin watched through his 34-85's gun sight as the German tanks moved broadside to his position. He had been ordered the previous evening to take up a defensive position and monitor German movements. His crew had worked through the night to prepare their ambush. The hull was already concealed. They had spent hours carefully weaving cornstalks around the turret to break up its silhouette. Oskin's loader, Alexei Potapovich Kalchev, held one of their precious BR-365P hypervelocity rounds. These were rare ammunition tungsten core projectiles with superior armour penetration. The crew had been issued only a handful. Standard practice was to save them for the most dangerous targets. The King Tigers were close now. Close enough that Oskin could see details through his optics. Close enough that their sides were fully exposed as they moved down the road. His gunner, Abubakir Yusupovich Merkaidarov, adjusted his aim for the second tank's turret. The range was perfect. The angle was ideal. The target was moving slowly. Merkaidarov pressed the trigger. The hypervelocity round struck the King Tiger's turret side. 80mm of steel armour, thick enough to stop most projectiles, angled to deflect others, failed. The tungsten core punched through. Inside the turret, the round's energy released in an instant. Metal fragments ricocheted through the cramped fighting compartment. The commander likely felt nothing. The loader, standing beside the ready ammunition racks, had perhaps a moment of recognition. Then the propellant charges in the stored ammunition ignited. What happened next took perhaps 3 seconds, maybe less. The ammunition stored in the turret's rear overhang, 23 rounds of 88mm shells detonated in a cascading explosion. The turret, weighing several tons, lifted from its ring mounting. It rose into the air, trailing flame and smoke. The force of the explosion was powerful enough to separate it completely from the hull. The crew compartment became an inferno. There was no time to react, no time to abandon the vehicle, no time to do anything except die. The turret crashed back to earth beside the burning hull. Smoke poured from every opening. The King Tiger, that moments before had been an invincible fortress of steel, had become a funeral pyre for its crew. To understand what happened on that road outside Oględów, you must understand what the King Tiger represented. Not just as a machine, but as an idea. The Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Ausf. B, its official designation, was Germany's answer to a problem that had become increasingly urgent by 1943. The Tiger I, formidable as it was, faced new threats on both fronts. Soviet 34-85s and IS-2 heavy tanks, American Shermans equipped with 76mm guns, British Fireflies with 17-pounder cannons. The gap in armour technology was closing. The King Tiger was designed to restore German supremacy in armoured warfare. Development began in 1942, when Henschel and Sohn received specifications from the Waffenamt, the German Army's weapons agency. The tank would combine the thick armour of the Tiger first with the sloped armour concepts proven effective on the Panther. It would mount a longer, more powerful version of the legendary 88mm gun. It would be nearly invulnerable from the front. It would outrange and outgun every Allied tank in service. The design that emerged was extraordinary by any measure. The King Tiger weighed 68.5 tons in combat configuration. Its upper front plate measured 150mm thick, sloped at 50 degrees. This created an effective thickness of over 200mm against projectiles striking at typical combat angles. The lower front plate was 100mm thick. The turret front, depending on whether it was the early Krupp design or the later production version, ranged from 185mm on the flat production turret to 100mm on the curved early turret. Even the side armour was 80mm thick, far heavier than the frontal armour on most Allied medium tanks. The main armament was the 8.8cm Key AWK 43L/71. This was not the same gun as the Tiger W's weapon, despite sharing the bore diameter. The KAWK 43 used a much larger cartridge case with substantially more propellant. Muzzle velocity for armour-piercing rounds reached over 1,000 meters per second. At 1,000 meters range, the gun could penetrate 202mm of armour plate sloped at 30 degrees. At 2,000 meters, it could still penetrate 132mm. These numbers meant that the King Tiger could destroy any Allied tank frontally at ranges where Allied guns could not reliably penetrate the German tank's armour. The optical equipment matched the weapon's precision. The Turmzielfernrohr 9D monocular sight, manufactured by Leitz, the same company that produced Leica cameras, provided 2.5 times magnification. During peacetime testing, gun crews achieved remarkable accuracy. 100% probability of first-round hit at 1,000 meters, 95 to 97% at 1,500 meters, 85 to 87% at 2,000 meters. Even in actual combat conditions, with the stress and confusion of battle, crews maintained over 80% hit probability at 1,000 meters. Inside, the King Tiger had a 5-man crew. The driver sat in the front left of the hull with adequate vision equipment. The radio operator machine gunner sat to the driver's right, operating a 7.92mm MG-34 machine gun in a ball mount. In the turret, 3 men worked in closer quarters. The commander stood in the cupola, with vision blocks providing all-around observation. The gunner sat to the commander's left, operating both the main gun and the coaxial machine gun. The loader stood to the commander's right. This loader had perhaps the most physically demanding job in the German Army's armoured forces. 88mm ammunition was heavy. A complete round projectile and cartridge case together weighed between 32 and 36 pounds, depending on ammunition type. The loader had to pull these rounds from storage racks, lift them, and load them into the breech. Then he had to remove the spent cartridge case after firing. Then repeat the process. The best loaders could maintain a rate of fire approaching 6 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. In combat, with the tank moving and taking fire, the rate dropped to perhaps 4 or 5 rounds per minute. To make the loader's job manageable, ammunition was stored throughout the tank. The hull sponsons, the widened sections of the hull on each side, contained racks for dozens of rounds. These were relatively safe from frontal fire, protected by the thick frontal armour and by the bulk of the engine and transmission, but they were not easily accessible to the loader during combat. Reaching down into the hull sponsons, pulling out a heavy round, lifting it to turret height, and loading it took time. So the King Tiger, like many tanks, also stored ready ammunition in the turret. 23 rounds in racks mounted in the rear overhang of the turret basket. These were within easy reach of the loader. He could maintain a higher rate of fire using these rounds. Standard practice was to exhaust the turret ammunition first, then reload from the hull stores during lulls in combat. This arrangement was not unique to the King Tiger. The Tiger I stored ammunition in hull sponsons. The Panther stored rounds in hull racks and in turret-mounted ready racks. American Shermans stored most of their ammunition in sponson racks and ready racks below the turret basket. Every tank represented compromises between protection, firepower, crew, efficiency, and ammunition capacity. Engineers knew that ammunition storage was vulnerable. They placed it in the most protected areas possible, while still allowing reasonable access for the loader. German tank crews in August 1944 had absorbed certain beliefs through training and combat experience. Their tanks were the best in the world. German optical equipment was superior to Allied equivalents. German guns hit harder and reached farther than enemy weapons. German armor could withstand hits that would destroy Allied tanks. These were not mere propaganda talking points. They were conclusions drawn from real combat engagements where King Tigers destroyed Soviet and American tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, equipped with King Tigers, received its tanks in June 1944. The battalion had been rebuilt after earlier losses. Crew training emphasized the King Tiger's strengths. Engage at long range, where your gun has the advantage. Keep your frontal armor toward the enemy. Use your superior optics to spot targets first. Trust your armor to protect you while you destroy enemy formations. When the battalion was ordered to resist the Soviet Lvov-Sandomierz offensive in August 1944, crews moved with the confidence of men who believed their equipment would keep them alive. They had been told the King Tiger was nearly invincible. The specifications supported this belief: 150 mm of sloped frontal armor, 185 mm on the turret front. No Soviet tank gun in service could reliably penetrate these thicknesses at combat ranges, but specifications tell only part of the story. The King Tiger that rolled toward the Vistula River bridge on August 12th carried a vulnerability that had nothing to do with armor, thickness, or gun performance. It carried 23 rounds of 88 mm ammunition in racks mounted in the Panzer turret. And the turret side armor, the armor protecting those racks, was 80 mm thick enough to stop machine gun fire, thick enough to deflect some projectiles, not thick enough to stop a hypervelocity tungsten core round fired at close range from a favorable angle. The Soviet 3485 that waited in ambush outside Oględów represented a different design philosophy. Where German tanks emphasized heavy armor and powerful guns, Soviet tanks emphasized mobility, reliability, and mass production. The 3485 weighed 32 tons, less than half the King Tiger's weight. Its armor was much thinner, 45 mm on the front hull, sloped at 60 degrees, 90 mm on the turret front. By German standards, this was inadequate protection, but the 3485 had advantages. It could reach 45 km/h on roads. It could traverse rough terrain that would bog down heavier vehicles. Its wide tracks distributed its weight, allowing it to operate in mud and snow where German tanks struggled. And its 85 mm ZISS-53 gun, while less powerful than the King Tiger's weapon, was adequate for most combat situations. More importantly, Soviet factories could build 3485s in numbers that German industry could not match. The Stalin Works in Kharkov, the Uralvagonzavod factory in Nizhny Tagil, factory number 183 in Nizhny Tagil, these facilities produced thousands of tanks per year. By August 1944, Guards tank brigades like Oskin's unit were fully equipped with the new 85 mm variant. Soviet crews had learned hard lessons about German armor. They knew they could not penetrate a King Tiger or Tiger I frontally. They knew they had to use terrain, concealment, and flanking attacks to create opportunities. This created asymmetry in combat psychology. German crews believed in frontal engagements where their superior armor and guns would prevail. Soviet crews believed in ambush and maneuver, attacking from directions where even thick armor could not protect German tanks. The Red Army had developed specific tactics for dealing with heavy German armor. Intelligence briefings identified weak points: the turret ring where the turret joined the hull, the lower front plate below the main armor belt, the engine deck at the rear, and most importantly, the side armor, which was much thinner than frontal protection. Soviet ammunition loadouts reflected this tactical doctrine. Most 34-85 crews carried a mixed load of armor-piercing, high-explosive, and hypervelocity rounds. The BR-365P hypervelocity round used a tungsten carbide penetrator in a lightweight aluminum body. This provided higher velocity than conventional steel projectiles. Higher velocity meant better armor penetration, especially against sloped armor where projectile energy was critical. But tungsten was scarce. Soviet industry could not produce hypervelocity rounds in unlimited quantities. Crews received only a few per tank, perhaps 5 to 10 rounds, out of a total load of 55 to 60 rounds. Standing orders were to save hypervelocity ammunition for the most dangerous targets. Use standard armor-piercing rounds against medium tanks and assault guns. Save the hypervelocity rounds for Tigers, Panthers, and other heavily armored targets where extra penetration might make the difference between success and failure. Lieutenant Oskin's decision to load hypervelocity ammunition before the King Tigers came into range showed tactical judgment. He recognized the threat. He understood his weapon's limitations against heavy German armor. He positioned his tank for a flank shot where Soviet guns had the best chance of penetration. And he waited for the ideal range close enough for maximum accuracy, close enough that armor-piercing performance would be at its peak. The King Tiger crews had no way of knowing they were being watched. Their commanders scanned for threats, but they were looking for visible enemy positions, dug-in anti-tank guns, tank formations in the open, infantry with anti-tank weapons in buildings or tree lines. A single 34 hidden in a cornfield with only its camouflaged turret exposed was nearly invisible. The German crews were focused on their objective, the bridge ahead. They were moving in column formation along a road, standard procedure for movement when immediate contact with the enemy was not expected. This was the reality of armored warfare in 1944. Superior equipment provided advantages, but it did not guarantee survival. Tactical position mattered. Situational awareness mattered. The side that saw first, shot first, and hit first often won regardless of paper specifications, and the vulnerabilities that engineers knew existed, ammunition storage, thin side armor, exposed fuel, tanks could be exploited by an enemy who understood them and created opportunities. When Oskin's gunner fired that first hypervelocity round, multiple factors converged in a single moment. Soviet tungsten core projectile meeting German armor plate at an angle favorable for penetration. Close range minimizing dispersion and maximizing retained energy. Side aspect where armor was thinnest. And most critically, the location of the hit the turret, precisely where 23 rounds of 88mm ammunition sat in their racks, propellant charges ready to burn, high explosive fillers ready to detonate. The King Tiger's crew had perhaps understood what was happening in that first instant after penetration. Perhaps they felt the impact. Perhaps they saw the flash as the penetrating projectile struck something inside the turret. Perhaps they had a moment to recognize what was about to occur. But recognition would not have saved them. The ammunition detonation that followed was not something a man could escape. It was not a fire that built gradually, giving time to bail out. It was an explosion that consumed the turret's interior in a fraction of a second. This was the hidden reality of heavily armed tanks. They carried their own destruction within them. Dozens of rounds, each containing propellant and explosive, each capable of adding to a catastrophic chain reaction if ignited. Armor protected these rounds under normal circumstances. Armor kept out bullets and shell fragments. But armor could be penetrated. And when it was penetrated in the wrong place, at the wrong angle, by the right kind of projectile, the tank became its crew's tomb. The 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion that deployed to Poland in August 1944 consisted of men who had undergone extensive training on the King Tiger. This was not a unit of inexperienced crews thrown into combat with unfamiliar equipment. Many had served in earlier heavy tank battalions. Some had crewed Tiger I tanks on the Eastern Front or in Normandy. They understood armoured warfare. They knew their machines. The battalion had received its full complement of 45 King Tigers between June and early August. The tanks came from the Henschel factory in Kassel, where production had reached a tempo of perhaps 15 to 20 vehicles per month by mid-1944. Each tank required approximately 300,000 man-hours to build. The thick armor plates had to be precisely cut, shaped, and welded. The complex transmission and final drive assemblies had to be manufactured to exacting tolerances. The 88mm guns had to be bored, rifled, and tested. German industry, in August 1944, operated under conditions that made even this limited production remarkable. Allied bombing had destroyed or damaged many factories. Raw materials were increasingly scarce. Molybdenum, essential for high-quality armor steel, was no longer available in sufficient quantities. Engineers substituted vanadium, but this changed the steel's properties. The armor became more brittle. Welds became weaker. Soviet testing of captured King Tigers would later reveal that the armor quality had declined compared to earlier German tanks. Shells that might have been defeated by proper steel instead caused the armor to crack and spall, sending fragments through the crew compartment even without full penetration. But in August 1944, German crews did not know this. They knew only what their training had taught them. The King Tiger manual, Tiger Fibel, emphasized the tank's strengths while acknowledging its limitations. The manual warned about mechanical reliability. The Maybach HL-230 engine produced only 600 horsepower, barely adequate for a 68-ton vehicle. The final drives, the gearboxes that transmitted power to the tracks, were prone to failure under stress. The battalion's experience on the road, march to the front, confirmed these warnings. Of 45 tanks that began the journey from the railhead at Jędrzejów, only 8 were operational when they reached the assembly area. The others had broken down with final drive failures, transmission problems, or overheated engines. 37 tanks disabled not by enemy action, but by mechanical failure. This was a breakdown rate exceeding 80% over a distance of approximately 50 kilometers. The crews and maintenance personnel worked frantically to repair the damaged vehicles, but many would remain inoperable for days. The unit that was supposed to deploy a full battalion could field only a single understrength company. Lieutenant Karnetsky commanded one of the 3 King Tigers that reached Oględów on the morning of August 12th. His crew consisted of men who had trained together for weeks. They knew their positions. The driver, whose name was not recorded in Soviet documents, had learned to manage the King Tiger's poor power-to-weight ratio. At 8.6 horsepower per ton, the tank accelerated slowly and struggled on inclines. Maximum road speed was 38 kilometers per hour, but cross-country speed dropped to perhaps 15 to 20 kilometers per hour depending on terrain. The radio operator machine gunner sat beside the driver with his MG-34. In the turret, the commander, gunner, and loader worked in a space that measured approximately 100 cubic feet. This was more generous than the cramped Tiger I turret, but still confined when you consider that 3 men had to operate within it while the tank moved and fought. The loader's position deserves particular attention because his role connects directly to what happened. German training emphasized speed and efficiency in ammunition handling. Loaders practiced until they could load, fire, extract the spent case, and reload in 12 to 15 seconds under ideal conditions. The King Tiger carried 84 rounds in its initial configuration, 23 in the turret ready racks, the remaining 61 in hull-sponson racks and floor storage. The turret racks were positioned in the rear overhang, the portion of the turret that extended behind the turret ring. This location made sense from an engineering perspective. The racks were out of the loader's way during normal operation but within easy reach when he needed ammunition. The overhang created storage space without making the turret basket larger, and the location kept the ammunition relatively protected. The rear of the turret had 80 to 82 millimeters of armor, sloped at an angle. This was adequate protection against most threats from typical engagement angles. But from the side, from precisely 90 degrees to the tank's centerline, the turret side armor was the only protection. 80 millimeters of steel plate. no sloping to increase effective thickness, no additional structural elements to deflect projectiles. Just 80 mm standing between the outside world and 23 rounds of 88 mm ammunition. Soviet intelligence had identified this vulnerability through examination of captured German tanks. Technical intelligence teams photographed and measured every aspect of German armor. They knew the thickness of every plate. They knew where ammunition was stored. They knew that turret side armor on the King Tiger was substantially thinner than frontal armor. This information was disseminated to tank crews through briefings and tactical instructions. Lieutenant Oskin had attended such a briefing. He knew that frontal attacks against King Tigers were futile. Soviet 85 mm guns could not penetrate the frontal armor at any practical combat range. Even the 122 mm guns on IS-2 heavy tanks struggled against the King Tiger's front. But the sides were different. 80 mm could be defeated. Not easily. Not with standard ammunition at long range. But with hypervelocity rounds at close range, penetration was possible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The BR-365P round that Oskin's crew loaded represented Soviet metallurgical and ballistic engineering at its best. The projectile weighed 3.65 kilograms. The tungsten carbide core measured 54 mm in diameter, smaller than the 85 mm bore. The core was enclosed in an aluminum body that engaged the rifling and centered the projectile in the barrel. Upon leaving the muzzle at approximately 1,050 meters per second, the aluminum body fell away. The tungsten core continued to the target, carrying enormous kinetic energy in a small cross-sectional area. Tungsten's density, 19.3 grams per cubic centimeter, was nearly twice that of steel. This density, combined with high velocity, gave the projectile exceptional penetration capability. Against 80 mm of armor at 200 meters range, at an angle close to perpendicular, penetration was virtually certain. The tungsten would punch through the steel, carrying fragments and molten metal into the interior space beyond. The gunner's trigger pull released the firing pin. The propellant charge in the 85 mm cartridge ignited. Pressure built to over 3,000 atmospheres in milliseconds. The tungsten core projectile accelerated down the barrel, emerged from the muzzle, shed its aluminum body, and crossed 200 meters in less than a fifth of a second. Inside the King Tiger's turret, the crew had no warning. Sound traveled slower than the projectile. By the time they might have heard the 34's gunfire, the round had already struck. The tungsten core hit the turret side armor at an angle nearly perpendicular to the plate surface. 80 millimeters of steel face hardened to resist penetration, welded with the best techniques available to German industry in 1944, failed. The physics of armor penetration are brutal and unforgiving. When a high-velocity projectile strikes armor, several things happen simultaneously. The projectile's kinetic energy focuses on a small area. The armor steel deforms under tremendous stress. If the projectile has sufficient energy and the armor insufficient thickness or quality, the steel yields. The projectile punches through, carrying a cone of armor fragments and molten metal. These secondary fragments often cause more damage than the projectile itself. The loader, standing beside the ammunition racks, likely saw the penetration. Perhaps he saw the flash as the tungsten core entered the turret. Perhaps he saw the shower of sparks as armor fragments ricocheted off interior surfaces. Perhaps he understood what was about to happen. Historical accounts from survivors of similar incidents suggest that experienced tankers recognized ammunition fires in the instant before they spread. But recognition provided no protection and no escape. The penetrating projectile and its accompanying fragments struck the propellant charges stored in the ready racks. Each 88 mm round contained approximately 4 kilograms of propellant. 23 rounds meant roughly 92 kilograms of propellant. Not all of it ignited simultaneously, but enough did. The propellant in tank ammunition is designed to burn rapidly but in a controlled manner when ignited by a primer. This controlled burn generates the gas pressure that propels the projectile. But when propellant ignites from external flame or fragment impact, the burn is neither controlled nor directional. It simply burns, releasing energy as heat and gas. In the confined space of a tank turret, this creates catastrophic overpressure. The fire spread from one round to the next in a cascading failure. Each round that ignited added to the inferno. High explosive shells contain additional explosive beyond the propellant charge. When these detonated, they added mechanical shock to the thermal effects. The crew had no chance. The commander in his cupola, the gunner at his station, the loader beside the racks, all were engulfed in flame and blast pressure in less than 3 seconds. The turret itself, weighing approximately 12 tons, sat on a bearing race that allowed it to rotate. This turret ring was designed to withstand the recoil forces of the main gun and the stress of turret traverse. It was not designed to contain an internal explosion of the magnitude now occurring. The blast pressure lifted the turret from its mounting. Eyewitness accounts from both Soviet and German sources describe seeing King Tiger turrets blown completely off their hulls when ammunition detonated. Oskin, watching through his optics, saw the second King Tiger erupt. One moment it was a functioning combat vehicle. The next, it was burning. The turret moved, lifted by internal forces, and smoke poured from every opening. The tank did not gradually catch fire the way vehicles sometimes did when hit by incendiary rounds. It exploded. The lead King Tiger's commander, responding to training and instinct, began traversing his turret toward the threat. His gunner searched for a target through the dust and smoke raised by the initial impact, but they were searching in the wrong direction, confused by the chaos, and unable to see Oskin's well-camouflaged position. Oskin ordered his gunner to engage the lead tank. 3 rounds struck the turret front, the thickest armor on the entire vehicle, 185 millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel. The shells ricocheted off without penetrating. Even hypervelocity rounds had limits. Against armor this thick, at this angle, penetration was not possible with 85mm projectiles. But Oskin's crew had learned from the first engagement. If the turret front was impenetrable, other areas were not. The 4th round struck the turret, ring the narrow gap where turret met hull. This was one of the weak points that Soviet intelligence had identified. Armor here was thinner to allow turret rotation. The tungsten core penetrated. And again, the ammunition stored in the turret racks ignited. The lead King Tiger burned exactly as the second one had. Catastrophic ammunition fire, turret blown from its mounting, crew killed before they could react. Lieutenant Karnetsky, whose name appears in German casualty records, died in one of these 2 tanks. So did Lieutenant Wiemann. So did 9 other German tank crewmen, whose names were recorded when their bodies were later recovered. The 3rd King Tiger, commanded by a crew whose names are lost to history, attempted to reverse away from the ambush. But the 3485 had advantages in mobility that the King Tiger lacked. Oskin ordered his driver to pursue. The Soviet tank, weighing 32 tons and powered by a 500-horsepower diesel engine, accelerated quickly. It maneuvered through the cornfield, while the King Tiger backed along the road, its driver unable to see behind the vehicle clearly, its commander focused on the threat to the front. Oskin's crew caught the German tank and maneuvered to its rear. The engine compartment armor was the thinnest on the entire vehicle, 50mm at the rear, protecting the Maybach engine and its fuel system. A single hypervelocity round penetrated this armor. The engine did not explode. Diesel fuel is difficult to ignite, but the penetration damaged the cooling system and the engine itself seized. The King Tiger stopped moving. The German crew made the rational decision to abandon their disabled vehicle rather than remain inside to be killed by follow-up shots or infantry assault. 3 crewmen escaped. One was captured immediately by the Soviet infantry, riding on Oskin's tank. The others may have escaped temporarily, but were listed as missing in German records. 1 crewman died during the egress, shot as he emerged from the tank. The engagement had lasted perhaps 10 minutes, from first shot to final immobilization. 3 of the most advanced tanks in the German arsenal had been destroyed or captured by a single 3485, firing from ambush. The tactical lessons were clear. Soviet crews learned that King Tigers could be defeated with proper tactics and positioning. German command learned that their newest heavy tank had a critical vulnerability. The battlefield after the engagement showed the physical reality of what had occurred. 2 King Tigers burned with the characteristic intense heat of ammunition fires. The flames consumed everything flammable: the rubber periscope seals, the leather padding on crew seats, the canvas map cases, the personal effects of the crew. The steel hulls glowed red in places where fire raged unchecked inside. The turret of the second King Tiger lay on the ground several meters from the hull, testimony to the violence of the internal explosion. Soviet soldiers who approached the wrecks later reported that the interiors were completely destroyed. Nothing remained intact. The crew stations were unrecognizable. The ammunition racks that had stored 23 rounds were twisted metal. The third King Tiger sat immobilized but largely intact. Soviet technical intelligence teams would arrive within hours to examine it. They would measure every aspect of the vehicle. They would photograph the penetration in the rear armor. They would document the layout of systems and storage. And most importantly, they would note the location and protection of the turret ammunition racks. This tank, after field repairs by Soviet engineers, was loaded onto a flatbed railcar and transported to the Kubinka proving grounds near Moscow. There it joined other captured German vehicles, undergoing systematic testing. Soviet ballistic engineers fired various weapons at the King Tiger's armor from measured ranges and angles. They documented what penetrated and what did not. They examined the quality of the armor steel and found it wanting compared to earlier German production. The Kubinka tests confirmed what the Oględów engagement had demonstrated. The King Tiger's frontal armor was indeed formidable. The 150mm upper glacis, sloped at 50 degrees, resisted everything the Soviets fired at it from ranges beyond 500 meters. Even multiple hits failed to penetrate. But the side armor told a different story. 80mm at vertical or near vertical angles could be penetrated by 85mm hypervelocity rounds at ranges up to 400 meters. 122mm guns could penetrate the sides reliably at much greater distances. And the welds, the joints where armor plates met, were particularly weak. Soviet engineers found that even when shells did not fully penetrate, the shock of impact caused welds to crack. Fragments broke free from the interior surface of the armor and became projectiles inside the crew compartment. The quality control that had characterized early war German tank production had degraded by late 1944. Armor plates that should have been resilient instead cracked. Welds that should have held separated under stress. The implications extended beyond a single engagement. The 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion's after-action reports attributed the losses to massive anti-tank defenses. This was not accurate, but it reflected what the surviving crews believed. They had not seen Oskin's single tank. They had only witnessed 3 of their vehicles destroyed in rapid succession. The natural assumption was that they had driven into a prepared defensive position with multiple anti-tank guns. German tactical doctrine was modified based on reports from the Eastern Front. Orders emphasized that King Tigers should avoid situations where their flanks could be exposed. They should fight hull down whenever possible, keeping only the turret exposed. They should maintain distance from enemy positions to prevent close-range flank shots. And critically, a new directive was issued. Ammunition would no longer be stored in the turret-ready racks during combat operations. This last change was the most significant. By eliminating turret ammunition storage, German commanders acknowledged the vulnerability that Oskin had exploited. Crews were ordered to store all ammunition in the hull sponsons, even though this meant the loader had to reach down into the hull to retrieve each round. The rate of fire would decrease. The loader's fatigue would increase. But the catastrophic ammunition explosions that had killed 11 men at Oględów might be prevented. The modification reduced ammunition capacity from 84 rounds to 68 rounds. Those 16 rounds that would have been stored in the turret were simply not carried. The tactical utility of the King Tiger diminished slightly with each such compromise. But the alternative crews dying in seconds when turret penetration ignited ready ammunition was unacceptable. For the Soviet tankers who had witnessed the engagement, the lesson was different. They learned that German heavy tanks, formidable as they were, could be defeated. Not through frontal attacks, not through long-range gunnery duels, but through careful positioning, proper ammunition selection, patient waiting, and precise shooting at vulnerable points. These were tactics that Soviet crews could execute. These were victories that could be replicated. Lieutenant Oskin received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award on September 23, 1944. The decoration recognized not just personal courage, but tactical effectiveness. His actions demonstrated that even the most advanced German armor could be countered by skilled crews using appropriate tactics. The citation emphasized that Oskin had destroyed 3 King Tigers, though this was slightly inaccurate, as one had been captured rather than destroyed, and had done so without losing his own vehicle or crew. The propaganda value was substantial. Soviet newspapers reported the engagement as evidence that German technical advantages were being overcome. Photographs of Oskin with his crew appeared in military publications. His tactics were analyzed and disseminated to other tank units. The specific techniques camouflage, patient ambush, flank attack, ammunition selection became part of training doctrine. But beyond propaganda and tactical lessons, the engagement at Oględów revealed a deeper truth about armored warfare in 1944. The King Tiger represented one approach to tank design. Maximize armor, maximize firepower, accept the cost in weight and mechanical complexity. This approach created a vehicle that was nearly invincible under ideal conditions. But ideal conditions rarely existed in combat, and when conditions favored the enemy close range, flank exposure, prepared ambush, even the King Tiger's massive armor could not guarantee survival. The fundamental problem was one that no amount of engineering could solve. Tanks had to carry ammunition to be useful. That ammunition had to be accessible to the loader, and storing high explosive shells and propellant charges inside an armored box created an inherent vulnerability. Every tank that ever rolled into combat carried within it the means of its own destruction. The only variables were the thickness of armor protecting the ammunition and the capability of enemy weapons to penetrate that armor. In August 1944, on a dirt road in Poland, those variables aligned in a way that destroyed 3 King Tigers and killed 11 German tankers. The crews likely never knew what hit them. They certainly had no time to react once penetration occurred. From the moment the tungsten core punched through the turret side armor until the ammunition detonation consumed the crew compartment, perhaps 3 seconds elapsed, maybe less. 3 seconds from confidence to catastrophe, from the belief that their armor would protect them to the reality that it had not. From being the crew of the most formidable tank in the German arsenal, to being casualties in a war that Germany was steadily losing. That was the true story of German tank crews when armor was penetrated in the wrong place. Not 8 seconds. Not time for recognition or regret. Just the instant transformation from life to death, mediated by the ammunition they carried to fight with. The 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion never recovered from the losses at Oględów and the subsequent fighting around the Sandomierz bridgehead. Of the 45 King Tigers that had been delivered to the unit in June and July, most were lost not to enemy action but to mechanical failure. Final drives continued to break, transmissions failed, engines overheated in the August heat. By mid-August, the battalion could field fewer than 10 operational tanks. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. Soviet forces expanded the Sandomierz bridgehead despite German counterattacks. The King Tigers that remained operational were used in increasingly desperate defensive actions. Crews found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by Soviet tank brigades that had learned to avoid frontal engagements. The technical superiority that German armor had enjoyed earlier in the war no longer translated to battlefield success when Soviet forces could call upon overwhelming numbers and increasingly effective tactics. German High Command issued new directives for King Tiger employment after reviewing reports from the Eastern Front. The August losses prompted detailed analysis. When investigators examined what had happened at Oględów, they discovered the pattern: multiple King Tigers destroyed by ammunition fires following turret penetration. The vulnerability was clear. The solution was implemented immediately. Order number 473, dated August 27, 1944, specified that turret ammunition storage was to be eliminated on all King Tiger tanks. Crews were instructed to remove the ready racks from the turret overhang and store all ammunition in hull sponsons. Field modification teams were sent to units to remove the turret racks physically. Photographs from September 1944 show King Tigers with empty spaces where the turret racks had been mounted. The modification created operational problems. Loaders now had to reach down into the hull sponsons for every single round. The physical effort increased substantially. A loader who could maintain 6 rounds per minute using turret-ready racks might manage only 3 or 4 rounds per minute when retrieving ammunition from hull storage. In extended engagements, this reduction in rate of fire could prove decisive. Crew fatigue became more pronounced. The loader's job, already physically demanding, became exhausting. After firing 20 or 30 rounds, the loader's arms trembled from repeatedly lifting 35-pound shells from floor-level storage up to breach height. Accuracy in combat suffered as tired loaders fumbled with ammunition or took longer to seat rounds properly in the breech. But the alternative was unacceptable. German tankers had seen what happened when turret ammunition ignited. Stories spread through the Panzer divisions. Veterans warned new crews about the vulnerability. The phrase, turret fire, carried particular dread. Crews knew that if their turret was penetrated near the ammunition storage, they had no chance of survival. The fire would consume them before they could react. This knowledge affected morale in ways that are difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. German tank crews, in late 1944, faced multiple pressures. They knew Germany was losing the war. They knew Allied material superiority was overwhelming. They knew that every engagement might be their last. Adding the knowledge that their own ammunition could kill them in seconds if the tank was penetrated in the wrong place created psychological stress that affected performance. Some crews became overcautious, refusing to engage when conditions were not ideal. Others became fatalistic, accepting that survival was primarily a matter of luck rather than skill. Unit cohesion suffered as experienced crews were killed and replaced by hastily trained replacements who lacked the technical proficiency and tactical judgment needed to survive in a King Tiger. The production consequences were equally significant. Henschel modified the King Tiger design to eliminate turret ammunition storage. New tanks rolled off the assembly line with redesigned turret interiors. The space where ready racks had been was left empty or used for other storage. But this modification came too late for the hundreds of King Tigers already in service. Field modification of existing tanks required time and resources that German forces increasingly lacked. By September 1944, Allied bombing had further disrupted King Tiger production. The Henschel factory at Kassel was hit repeatedly. Production rates dropped from the already inadequate 15 to 20 tanks per month to single digits. Some months saw fewer than 10 King Tigers completed. Meanwhile, American factories were producing 500 Sherman tanks per month. Soviet factories were producing over 1,034 variants per month. The numerical disparity was simply insurmountable. The Oględów engagement influenced Soviet tactics throughout the remainder of the war. Tank brigades adopted standard procedures for engaging German heavy armor. Avoid frontal attacks. Use terrain and concealment to create ambush opportunities. Target side and rear armor. Save hypervelocity ammunition for heavily armored targets. These tactics proved effective not only against King Tigers, but against Tigers, Panthers, and other German armor. Soviet combined arms coordination improved based on lessons learned in Poland. Tank units worked more closely with infantry to prevent German tanks from maneuvering freely. Artillery was pre-registered on likely German approach routes to catch armor before it reached favorable defensive positions. Air support was coordinated to attack German tanks during movement when they were most vulnerable to flanking attacks. The psychological impact on German crews cannot be overstated. Before Oględów, King Tiger crews believed they were nearly invulnerable. After Oględów and similar engagements, they knew they were not. The distinction mattered enormously. Confidence is a force multiplier in combat. When crews trust their equipment and believe in their tactical superiority, they take necessary risks, execute aggressive maneuvers. When that confidence erodes, even technically superior equipment cannot compensate for defensive, hesitant tactics. Lieutenant Oskin continued serving through the end of the war. His 3485 participated in the Vistula River offensive that carried Soviet forces from Poland into Germany. He survived the war, an achievement in itself considering the casualty rates among Soviet tank crews. After the war, he attended various ceremonies and commemorations. Photographs from the 1960s and 70s show him as an older man, wearing his Hero of the Soviet Union medal, surrounded by other veterans. The captured King Tiger remained at Kubinka for decades. It became one of the most studied vehicles in the Soviet collection. Engineers and armor specialists examined it repeatedly. The penetration hole in the rear armor was preserved as evidence of how the tank had been defeated. Visitors to Kubinka can still see this vehicle today, though it has been restored and is no longer in the exact condition it was in when captured. The tactical lessons from Oględów spread beyond Soviet forces. Intelligence sharing among Allied powers meant that American and British forces learned of the King Tiger's vulnerabilities. British intelligence reports from September 1944 specifically mentioned turret ammunition storage as a critical weak point. American tank destroyer battalions received updated briefings on German armor that emphasized side and rear attacks. The Western Allies faced King Tigers in smaller numbers than Soviet forces, but when they did encounter them, the same vulnerabilities applied. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, American forces destroyed multiple King Tigers. Some were knocked out by M36 tank destroyers using 90mm guns. Others were destroyed by flanking attacks from M4 Shermans that managed to hit side or rear armor, and some were abandoned by their crews when mechanical failures left them immobilized. The pattern repeated across all theaters where King Tigers fought. Technical superiority in armor and armament provided advantages in specific tactical situations, long-range engagements, defensive positions with good fields of fire, situations where frontal attacks were the only option for Allied forces. But in fluid combat where Allied forces could maneuver, where air superiority prevented German concentration, where numerical advantage allowed multiple simultaneous attacks from different directions, the King Tiger's advantages diminished. Germany produced approximately 490 King Tigers before the war ended. This represented an enormous investment of industrial capacity, skilled labor, and scarce materials. Each tank required molybdenum, tungsten, nickel, and other alloying elements that Germany increasingly lacked. Each tank required precision manufacturing that strained German industry's capabilities. Each tank represented resources that might have been used to produce 3 or 4 Panzer IV medium tanks or 5 or 6 Stooge assault guns. The strategic wisdom of producing King Tigers has been debated by military historians for decades. The argument in favor emphasizes that Germany needed technological advantages to compensate for numerical inferiority. A single King Tiger could theoretically defeat multiple Allied tanks. In defensive operations, where German forces could choose terrain and engagement ranges, King Tigers achieved impressive kill ratios. Some individual tanks are credited with destroying dozens of Allied vehicles. The argument against production emphasizes reliability problems, logistical burden, and limited strategic impact. King Tigers broke down constantly. They consumed fuel at rates that strained German logistics. They were difficult to transport by rail because of their weight and width. They required specialized training for crews and maintenance personnel. And despite their impressive capabilities, 490 King Tigers could not materially affect the outcome of a war where Germany faced thousands of Allied tanks supported by overwhelming air power and artillery. The Oględów engagement crystallized this debate. Here was a situation where 3 King Tigers representing millions of Reichsmarks in production costs and thousands of hours of skilled labor were destroyed in minutes by a single 3485 firing from ambush. The tactical calculation was brutally clear. Germany had invested enormous resources in vehicles that could be defeated by competent enemy crews using appropriate tactics. The ammunition storage vulnerability became emblematic of larger problems in German tank design philosophy. German engineers prioritized performance characteristics, armor thickness, gunpowder, optical quality over operational requirements like reliability, ease of maintenance, and protection of internal systems. This created vehicles that were technically impressive but operationally fragile. American tank design philosophy was fundamentally different. The Sherman was not the best tank of World War II by any single performance metric. Its armor was thinner than German heavy tanks. Its 75mm gun was less powerful than German 88mm weapons. Its top speed was unremarkable. But the Sherman was reliable. It was easy to maintain. It was produced in overwhelming numbers. And critically, ammunition storage in later Sherman variants was designed with wet stowage ammunition racks surrounded by water jackets that would absorb heat and prevent fires from spreading. This design difference reflected different industrial and military philosophies. American engineers assumed that tanks would be hit and focused on keeping the crew alive after penetration. German engineers assumed that armor would prevent penetration and focused on making that armor as thick as possible. When reality demonstrated that no armor was impenetrable, the American approach proved more survivable. Soviet design philosophy fell between these extremes. Soviet tanks had thinner armor than German heavy tanks, but used sloping to increase effective protection. Soviet ammunition storage was not as sophisticated as American wet stowage, but Soviet crews were trained to minimize onboard ammunition and reload from external storage when possible. And Soviet production emphasized quantity over refinement, good enough vehicles in overwhelming numbers rather than perfect vehicles in limited quantities. The 3485 that Oskin commanded embodied this philosophy. It was not as well protected as a King Tiger, its gun was not as powerful, its optics were inferior, but it was fast, reliable, producible in quantity, and adequate for the tactical situations Soviet forces faced. When employed properly, as Oskin demonstrated, it could defeat even the most advanced German armor. The long-term legacy of the Oględów engagement extends into post-war tank design. Every major military studied the lessons of World War II tank combat. The vulnerability of ammunition storage became a primary concern. Post-war tanks incorporated blast-proof ammunition compartments, blowout panels that would direct explosion force away from the crew compartment, and automated loading systems that eliminated the need for stored ammunition near crew positions. Modern main battle tanks, like the American M1 Abrams, store ammunition in a separate compartment behind the turret with blowout panels in the roof. If the ammunition is hit and explodes, the force vents upward and outward rather than into the crew compartment. This design choice directly reflects lessons learned from incidents like Oględów, where ammunition fires killed crews in seconds. The human cost of the Oględów engagement was 11 German tankers dead and 1 captured. These were not abstract statistics. They were young men. The average age of German tank crews in 1944 was approximately 23 years, who had trained for months, who believed their armor would protect them, who died before they could react to the threat. Their families received notification through official channels. Their names were added to casualty lists. Their personal effects were sorted and returned when possible. The story that began on a dirt road in Poland in August 1944 has echoes that extend far beyond that single engagement. It is a story about the gap between design specifications and combat reality, about the difference between what engineers promised and what soldiers experienced, about the moment when belief in technological superiority collided with the physics of armor penetration and the chemistry of propellant combustion. The German tank crews who climbed into their King Tigers that morning believed certain things. They believed their armor would protect them. they believed their gun would destroy enemy tanks before those tanks could threaten them. They believed that German engineering superiority would compensate for numerical inferiority. These beliefs were not irrational. They were based on specifications, on training, on early combat experiences where King Tigers had dominated enemy armor. But beliefs, however well-founded, cannot change physical reality. 80 millimeters of steel cannot stop a tungsten core projectile fired at close range. Ammunition stored in a turret will explode if ignited. And crews trapped in a burning tank have no time to escape when the detonation is measured in seconds rather than minutes. Lieutenant Oskin and his crew knew different things. They knew that frontal attacks were futile. They knew that patience and positioning could create opportunities. They knew that even the most formidable enemy could be defeated if you understood their vulnerabilities and created the conditions to exploit them. This knowledge, combined with skill and courage, allowed them to destroy 3 King Tigers without losing their own vehicle. The aftermath of Oględów forced both sides to confront uncomfortable truths. German forces had to acknowledge that their newest and most advanced tank had a critical vulnerability. The immediate response eliminating turret ammunition storage addressed the symptom but not the underlying problem. The King Tiger was too heavy, too complex, too difficult to produce in adequate numbers. No amount of tactical adjustment could overcome these fundamental limitations when facing enemies who had numerical superiority and increasingly effective weapons. Soviet forces learned that technical sophistication was not necessary to achieve tactical success. Proper employment of adequate equipment, combined with careful preparation and skilled execution, could overcome apparently superior enemy forces. This lesson applied beyond tank combat. It validated the Soviet emphasis on mass production of good enough weapons rather than limited production of perfect weapons. For historians and military analysts, Oględów provides a case study in the relationship between technology and tactics. The King Tiger was objectively superior to the 3485 in almost every measurable way. It had thicker armor, it had a more powerful gun, it had better optics. Yet, in this engagement, the technically inferior tank defeated 3 technically superior tanks. The lesson is clear. Tactical employment matters more than technical specifications. Position, surprise, and proper ammunition selection overcame armor, thickness, and gun power. The engagement also illustrates the law of unintended consequences in military technology. German engineers designed the King Tiger to be the ultimate tank. They maximized armor protection and firepower. But these design choices created weight that strained the drivetrain and limited mobility. Limited mobility made the tank vulnerable to flanking attacks, and the ammunition necessary to feed the powerful gun became a vulnerability when stored in locations accessible to the loader. Every design choice involves trade-offs. German designers chose protection and firepower over mobility and reliability. This choice created a tank that was devastating in ideal conditions but vulnerable when conditions favored the enemy. American designers chose reliability and producibility over maximum protection. Soviet designers chose mobility and quantity over comfort and refinement. Each approach had strengths and weaknesses. None was objectively superior in all situations. The crews who died at Oględów represented a larger tragedy. They were victims not just of Soviet marksmanship, but of strategic decisions made years earlier. When German leadership chose to invade the Soviet Union, when industrial planners prioritized heavy tanks over medium tanks, when supply officers failed to provide adequate spare parts and maintenance support, when training facilities produced crews with inadequate preparation time. Each of these decisions contributed to the situation that placed 3 King Tigers on a road where a single 34 could ambush them. The broader narrative of World War II is often told through major battles and strategic campaigns: Stalingrad, Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge. But the war was also decided by thousands of small engagements like Oględów. 3 tanks destroyed, 11 men killed, 1 tank captured. These events seemed minor at the time, but aggregated across hundreds of similar engagements, they represented the steady erosion of German combat power and the growing capability of Soviet forces. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the King Tiger's reputation had changed completely. It was no longer seen as invincible. It was seen as a symbol of Germany's inability to match Allied material production, impressive in specifications, limited in impact. A weapon that represented what Germany wanted to be but could not achieve technologically superior enough to overcome numerical inferiority. The tank that Oskin captured sits today in a museum at Kubinka. Visitors can walk around it, examine the penetration hole in the rear armor, look into the turret where ammunition once was stored. The tank is a monument to a specific engagement, but also to larger truths about warfare, technology, and the gap between design and reality. The German crews who died never knew that their experience would be studied by historians and military analysts for decades. They never knew that the vulnerability that killed them would influence tank design for generations. They knew only that they were supposed to be protected by the best armor Germany could produce, and that this armor failed when it mattered most. That failure not in the armor itself, but in the belief that armor alone could guarantee survival, is the real lesson of Oględów. No tank is invincible, no armor is impenetrable, no design is without vulnerability. The crews who understand this, who plan accordingly, who create tactical situations where their strengths overcome enemy advantages, these are the crews who survive. The ones who trust blindly in specifications and armor thickness are the ones who die in seconds when reality penetrates their steel shell. August 12, 1944, a dirt road in Poland. 3 King Tigers, 11 dead tankers, and a lesson about the cost of believing that engineering could overcome all tactical disadvantages. That was the truth that German tank crews learned when 85mm tungsten cores punched through 80mm armor and ignited the ammunition they carried. Not 8 seconds, just an instant. Just the time it takes for propellant to ignite and steel to fail. Just long enough to realize that the armor you trusted could not save you. Then nothing. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.